Can you say something about the situation on gender identity in your country? Is there self-ID?
Lithuania is a country in the Eastern Europe, so we are a part of European Union, but we have been occupied for some time by Soviet Union. So the independence happened only in the 90s, and after the independence, the country itself went with the conservative kind of like politics most of the times. So because of this, our society in general is very homophobic. I would give you an example. So we actually have a law that says that we cannot share information about homosexuality with minors. So people who are underage, it's actually implemented into the law, and it goes under the categories as, like, for example, alcohol, drugs, and so on, or violence, so that the youngsters, they cannot see this kind of information and they cannot be exposed to it. And homosexuality is one of these criteria. So that's the level of the homophobia in Lithuania. Transgenderism is like a progressive conversion therapy for homosexuals and especially lesbians. And I'm really interested in this specific topic because I am a lesbian myself. And I know for a fact that if not a radical feminist that I met a few years ago, I might have been transitioning myself because of the pressure that comes from the whole context in Lithuania. And so that's why I'm so against this transgenderism ideology in general. As we all know, probably that most the transgenderism ideology itself has more points, but this specific homosexual conversion therapy point of view is the most interesting to me. So, but Lithuanian context is really interesting in this way because since the homophobia is at such a high level, interestingly, homosexuals, they are completely denied and they are completely not seen in a public sphere or in a political sphere. So, as I see from the global context with the more liberal societies, transgenderism is a way of converting, for example, lesbians. And in Lithuania, since the level of homophobia is such high, we don't have to do it here in a way, because the homosexuals in general are denied. So this transgenderism is not going, you know, like it's not supported in a political or a public sphere. And also I think it's connected with the gender norms and gender roles that are very, very strict in Lithuania. I mean, it's a conservative country in general, if you would look at the whole population. And interestingly, I also see that, for example, human rights organizations that are working in Lithuania, they are never focusing on this issue. And there was this like a pride or protest that was happening just a week or two ago. And they had 3 demands. So you would think that the first demand would be regarding this law that is implemented in our system. Unfortunately, this was the third demand that they produced. The first one was actually trans rights. And the second was about gay marriage and adoption of children. So I find it very, very confusing. And I felt very angry that the human rights organizations are focusing all the time, and they're trying to pass the transgenderism because they are not trying to help decrease the homophobia that is happening in our country. I think that this is the main focus that we need to get to. We need to, first of all, make homosexuality as acceptable in our society.
I kind of don't have much to say because my reality does not see transgenderism or men's feeling woman as an issue yet. In fact, in my country, there is no laws that talk about this issue. I'm not saying that there is no people that actually follow this pattern, but there are few ones, and the government doesn't consider an issue yet. But even though there is not considering an issue, there is still a problem, especially on regards to women's rights in Angola. African culture normally says that men comes first and the woman needs to follow. So it's been a very hard and a very hard fight for women to gain rights and to actually win their place in society. Until today, if a woman has like a good place, or if he works or has, for example, has the CEO position, people won't think that they is actually her gain. She was there because she worked hard for it. They're gonna say no, she slept with somebody because this is what girls do.
Late 19, I got an invitation by the initiative Queer Nations, mostly gays, few lesbians, to have a queer lecture later to be published in an anthology on transgender issues from a red femme point of view. The announcement for the queer lecture in February reads as follows. It is one of the firmly held beliefs of the left liberal mainstream that gender identity is fluid and that trans women as well as trans men break up the dichotomy of man and woman. This lecture wants to go beyond these attributions, presenting possible consequences of a tortuous path that dissociates mind from body, regression into gender stereotypes, negation of homosexual desire, sterilization and mutilation of young girls' bodies, erasure of the category woman in public law, and hence also the erasure of feminism and women's rights. Since the 1990s, queer theory and the liberated, so-called liberated gender diversity that came in its wake in the form of trans culture has managed to make the feminist fight for equality with men, even in UN bodies, look increasingly out of fashion, especially lesbian fight for an autonomous sexual identity. This lecture takes on the excessive logic of discrimination of the new zeitgeist and takes a close look at the role of the medical profession whose evidence base is being eroded. Furthermore, it looks at the importance of official sex entry at birth and conveys the message of lesbian radical feminism. This announcement had a huge impact, as turned out a couple of days later. The host initiative Queer Nations apologized to the queer feminist community for having dared to announce such a lecture. And the host, who was giving the equipment and the room, refrained from and shut down and canceled the meeting. The gay moderator of Initiative Queer Nations tried to defend himself in a blog, stating it is still better to invite a red femme than a real Nazi. So I was a quasi, an almost Nazi. After the first wave of shitstorm, a second, even larger wave approached, published in a liberal Berlin newspaper, authored by international academia, women professors from Canada, UK, Israel, USA, and Australia, led by queer feminists. They tried not just to defame me as a so-called expert, using anti-Semitic titles, accusing me of being hostile to trans persons and using an excluding logic that would be incompatible with politics of emancipatory solidarity in queer and feminist communities. In a so-called plea to politicians, they try to reach beyond me, attacking the only lesbian director of Initiative Queer Nations, and in particular of another initiative called Elberskirchen Hirschfeldhaus, a queer cultural house, it's called, that is financed by the Berlin State Senator for Cultural Affairs, asking for closure of the latter and fire the directors altogether. I would say that is hate speech financed by taxpayers' money. Finally, these queer feminists have not been successful, but their hate speech was published and the reputation of the attacked persons got damaged. A couple of months later, some lesbian archives, member of this Elberskirchen, terminated their membership due to the announced Red Femme lecture they didn't agree with and asked the Berlin Senate to forward the grants directly to them without success.
I come from Greece. It is a small country in Mediterranean. It also belongs in the European Union. So before 2017, there was a restrictive law on the matter of gender identity, which dated back in 1976 and was amended in 1997. And that law required hormone therapy and gender reassignment surgery to change someone's official documents. In addition, trans people needed to be under medical surveillance to prove that they changed their sex in order to conclude with the bureaucratic process and acquire their new documents. And the previous law was considered outdated in 2017, and it was criticized for demanding extensive medical procedures and for the time it required to change someone's official documents. So concerning the new law, the one of 2017, it permits gender reassignment surgery to people older than 17 years of age, with the exception of 15 years of age in particular only cases, demanding medical surveillance of the trans teenager from a medical committee of 5 experts 2 years before the gender reassignment process begins, and parental consent from the lawful guardians of the teenager. The main problem that arises in this law is that there are no longer any prerequisites for the regulation of the registered gender. And more specifically, the law states clearly that for the correction of the registered gender, there is no demand for the provision of any legal documents that prove that the individual has undergone hormone therapy and or gender reassignment surgery. In other words, gender identification is solely based on someone's self-identification in Greece. Now, the law was introduced from the so-called radical left party of CEDAW in cooperation with the right-wing nationalist party of ANEL, and it was also voted from 2 smaller centrist parties. it is important to mention that the law does not cover the cases of non-binary or gender people who wish to delete the indication of the binary sex in their official documents. A similar case was overruled by the court in Greece when a non-binary trans activist demanded to have a different indication apart from M for male or F for female in his legal documents. And as far as I'm concerned, there haven't been any incidents with trans women in film spaces yet. However, the existing legal framework could create future problems for women's sex-based rights, and major questions arise as in the case of what happens if trans people apply for women-only positions in political parties, or if trans people can have access in women's shelters and prisons in the future.
Japan's situation, I think, is actually quite similar to UK and US in the sense that academic feminists are very much, well, Japanese academic feminists are very much influenced by queer theory at the moment, and so, and one of the most active academic feminists in Japan, she's actually a professor in Tokyo University, which is supposed to be the best, one of the best universities in Japan. But she's a real fan of Butler, and so these people, these feminist academic feminists are quite active, and also quite. They are active in mainstream media, so their views are seen as the sort of the stereotypical feminist views in Japan. But Japan is still a very much patriarchal country, very much misogynistic, and feminism itself is still, I think, seen as a sort of a import from the West, from the Western world. So and like we don't even have a Japanese word corresponding to gender, because in Japanese Japanese isn't a gendered language, so we don't even have this kind of a idea of gender. So we traditionally only have the idea of sex, but now gender sounds much more progressive, and people start to use the word gender rather than sex. So I think so in that sense, like US and UK, there's this kind of a beginning of mixing up sex with gender. But all these things are done from the top, from the academics, from the bureaucrats and all that. And what drew my attention to transgenderism in the first place was that in 2018, so 2 years ago, there was a news article talking about a trans-identified man is now allowed to enter women-only college in Japan. And at that moment, I think most Japanese people thought that was actually a good thing, because most of us thought, by trans-identified man, we all thought it meant transsexual people with maybe gender identity disorder who've gone through gender reassignment surgery. But what surprised many people was that there are again academic feminists on Twitter who have actually worked to get this legislation gone through. So that to work to change the legislation to allow trans-identified men to enter women's college. these academic feminists start to say things like, well, gender is fluid, and you can change your gender, and you don't even have to go, you don't even have to go through gender reassignment surgery. And so some people on Twitter, some women on Twitter started asking, well, what do you mean? Aren't those trans-identified men, haven't they gone through operation? And if they haven't, do they have to, do women have to share shower room or changing room with those trans-identified men? And especially many Japanese women were concerned because in Japan we have this culture of public bath or hot springs, where, well, public bath, hot springs, sort of the same thing, but Japan is a very humid country, and in order to be hygienic, you really need to bathe every day. And so public bath is actually essential for poor, maybe working class people who don't have bath or shower in their home. So, and also hot springs are actually really a big part of Japanese culture, and many women go and visit hot springs to get relaxed. And usually public baths are all sex segregated. But but then suddenly these academic feminists start to say that, well, even if a trans-identified men haven't had operations, if they identify as women, then they are women. So it's transphobic to refuse them access to public baths. And some women, because these things are said by academics who have great credentials, and up until then, people, well, I think many women have respected them for being academic feminist. But then these people will start to say that, well, even if they have male bodies completely intact, as long as they identify as women, they are women. So they should be allowed to, at the moment, even though well, at the moment Japanese law doesn't allow them access, but